Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus app. Comes on your phone. It looks like that. You just touch that one right there. And it opens up and you have a whole host of courses and lectures you can listen to. Hundreds of courses, thousands of lectures. You don't have to buy just one course anymore. You get all the courses for a monthly fee. When you sign up through my site, you get a free trial, and then it's just $10 a month for the first quarter, I think. And then it's an incredible product because instead of like grinding through a whole book or whole course, if you decide you don't like a lecture, it's boring, you skip to the next lecture, or you skip courses. So like I was in the middle of listening to this George Orwell course. It's fantastic. About how all the trouble he had getting Animal Farm published. I had no idea. Anyway, but then I see, this pops up, coronavirus outbreak, what you need to know. Boom, I'm going to that one. I'm going to listen to that lecture on the way home today because, well, that's what everybody's talking about now. Okay, so for the deal, you get a free trial plus $10 a month. After that, you go to greatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. My guest this week is Katherine Stewart. Her new book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Most of you know this has been quite a concern of mine for decades, really. And I thought we had really passed the hurdle there after the rise of the nuns and the defeat of the intelligent design creationists and the kind of decline of the moral majority. But no, Katherine documents here all the nefarious ways that Christian nationalists try to use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. I called it cheating. She didn't call it cheating, but seems like a pretty strong word. But in any case, Katherine Stewart's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the American Prospect, the Atlantic, and other publications. She's the author of The Good News Club, an investigation of the religious right and public education. She does have a chapter in here on public education, school choice, vouchers, things like that, how they get manipulated by religious nationalists in a way that is not very pluralistic in its goals. In any case, we also cover Trump, how it is that 81% of white evangelicals would vote for him rather than, say, Ted Cruz or pretty much anybody else would have been a better candidate in that sense. But that isn't what they were after. That is the moral character of the candidate. Instead, the judges he's going to appoint and so forth. Anyway, she's got a rich trove of research in the book that she recounts here of historically and how Christian nationalists use big data to mine voter rolls and get preachers to get the vote out before elections and so on, way better than Democrats do it. So if anything, I would recommend Democrats read this book to see how it's done on the other side. I recorded this on the day after the Bernie bros, strong supporters of Bernie Sanders, said they're not going to vote for Biden, they're going to vote for Trump. Okay, Republicans would never do this. The ones that hated Trump, they just held their nose and pulled the handle for him anyway. It's a team sport. So anyway, with that, I give you Katherine Stewart. Thanks for listening. Katherine Stewart, thanks for coming on the show. Your book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Most of my guests, I tell them how much I enjoyed reading their book. Your book made me mad, infuriated that, they're cheating. Who's cheating? Well, Christian nationalists, in essence. So let's start there. What is a Christian nationalist, and what drove you to get into this movement?
Well, first I want to start with the notion. This is a movement that's not exactly cheating. It's using the tools of democracy to dismantle democracy. It's not that we're hiding, it's that we're not listening. So the movement I'm writing about is religious nationalism. The first thing to note is that it's really not a particular creed, but a political ideology and movement that often cloaks itself in religious rhetoric. The movement is often described as evangelical, but that's not quite right. It includes some evangelicals, and it also excludes many evangelicals too, and includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. So religious nationalism, as I mentioned, is a political ideology that asserts that the foundation of legitimate government is based on a particular interpretation of, like, a conservative interpretation of religion. It basically asserts that our government is based on the Bible, and is always warning that we need to sort of recover our so-called Judeo-Christian roots in order to take it back. And religious nationalism is also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating a large segment of the American public.
Yeah. So,
and basically concentrating power in the hands of a new elite.
yeah. So I imagine one response by so-called Christian nationalists, or whatever they would call themselves, to your book as, yeah, so this is the way the game is played. So too bad. We're doing it better than you are now.
Exactly. That's absolutely true. They are doing it better. And in a nation where 40 to 50% of people are out to vote, it doesn't take a majority of a country to win elections. All it takes is a really coherent and determined and united minority of the country. And I think that there are a lot of folks who want to, opposed to the politics of conquest and division that the movement represents, many of whom are Christian themselves, but don't really understand what they're looking at, why this sort of smaller and quite radical election. So that's the reason I wrote my book, to sort of lay out as much of this system as I can. So the book is really a deep dive into this sort of inner workings and leading personalities of that movement that has turned religion into a tool for political power.
Yeah. Is there any personal interest in this? How were you raised? As a secularist, or were you raised religious, or what's your connection here?
Sure. I'm Jewish, and my husband was raised Catholic. So we, really enjoy the cultural traditions of both of our faiths. But I've always been really committed to the values of pluralism and diversity that our nation was founded upon. Separation of church and state is not just a sort of legal technicality, and it's not just something for atheists. It's a principle that has united our country since our nation's founding and has served to hold us together, even as so many other nations have been torn apart, sectarian division.
Yeah. Here's a heuristic I use for analyzing claims. Just picture a 2x2 matrix, okay? So you have 4 cells, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say in this cell you have Christian conservatives who are trying to manipulate democracy using money and so on. And in this cell you have Christian conservatives who don't do any of that. And now in this cell you have, let's say, Democrat Christians who try to manipulate the system with money. And here you have Democrats that don't do it. So your book is primarily focused on this: Christian nationalists using money to manipulate politics to get their way. Are you sure, is there data showing that they're really doing this more than, say, the Democrats are doing it?
Well, one thing that's really clear is that, let's make it clear that there's a large movement of progressive Christians who are oppose these politics of conquest and division that the movement represents. They have the reins of political power. Religious nationalists have. And, I really lay out a lot of this ecosystem of this movement in my book. It consists of a variety of for-profit and nonprofit organizations, legal advocacy groups, right-wing policy groups, sort of funded thinks that work with religious nationalists in order to sort of change this system, bring about the changes that they want. Let's just look at the courts. I mean, to date, Trump has appointed 192 federal justices. That's over 22% of the federal judiciary. The movement is incredibly focused on courts because they know that if you change the courts, you can really get the rulings you want and change the culture. So they've done this over decades, and I really explain this in my book, how this is not just movement long preceded Trump and will long outlast him. They've done this over decades. One of the leading lights of the movement, a fellow named said, I'm going to paraphrase him here. He said something like, arm yourself with the mentality of the distance, not the sprinter. So that's really what they've done. They've been incredibly unified and coherent and long range in their thinking.
How many judges did President Obama appoint in his 8 years?
I don't have those numbers in front of me.
But I mean, but I'm asking, are Republicans more active in this category than Democrats?
They're absolutely focused. And we have to remember also that Obama was barred by Mitch McConnell and sort of increased radical um, Republican Party from making these kinds of appointments. Right, it seems that Democrats and Republicans used to come together more often to work on areas of mutual interest, more the politics of give and take. But unfortunately, this movement is responsible for a kind of hyper-partisanization of the Republican Party, which sees the world in terms of absolute good or absolute evil, or as they explain it, the party of life and the party of death. Those are actually words that they've used to explain. And so anything, they're sort of rejecting the idea of the cooperation and collaboration.
Yeah, there is data showing that we are far more polarized, say, since 2004 even. That is, the number of people that self-identify as centrist is shrinking, and the number of people that identify as far left or far right is increasing. So there's no question about that. And I think conservative talk radio has made it worse, and television as well, leading other networks to have to push the other direction. So you get this polarization effect. I think that's true. My professional connection. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we can't overestimate the influence of that sort of right-wing media propaganda sphere on framing the issues for so many people. I want to go back very briefly to what you said about judges. So over the past 10 years, as I've been researching this book, a lot of right-wing and strategy meetings, and just places that one is allowed to go. And often they have a press section, things like that. And they often are very focused on judges. I remember one movement leader, saying the election is all about judges, judges, judges. And there was also a moment where Trump was kind of himself, sort of offering himself to movement leadership as the guy that they should unite behind. This is in advance of the 2016 election. And he held up a list of judges and he said, these judges, I'm going to select judges from this list. Here it is. You can all vet it if you want. And these judges are all pro-life. And pro-life becomes sort of a stand-in to represent a much broader agenda that the movement holds.
Yeah. I guess my professional connection to your book is as a lifelong observer and participant in the creationist evolution debate, so-called debate. That's gone through really 4 stages of, banning the teaching of evolution that climaxed in the Scopes trial, and then equal time for Genesis and Darwin that after Sputnik and some court cases that died, and then equal time for creation-science, evolution-science, and then the intelligent design movement. Well, we've defeated them on all counts, and by the end of the Dover trial in late 2005, that kind of put an end to that. So I thought, well, science education is pretty safe now. And then Obama got elected. And then for, 8 years, we had, kind of a more ecumenical secularist government, I thought. And then finally the rise of the nuns, that 25% of all Americans, 33% of millennials have no religious affiliation, which, we secular humanists and atheists and skeptics have been triumphing for years. So I thought, well, I have nothing to worry about. They've sort of gone away. But as you show, they've actually just shifted and taken different strategies from, say, the 1980s moral majority Jerry Falwell approach to the kinds of things you document. So kind of walk us through what's happened since Reagan years and the moral majority to what they're doing now.
Oh gosh, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, in the Reagan years, let's remember, and Reagan passed the most progressive legislation, liberalizing abortion law. 1967. The movement was not as Republican Party, I should say, was not nearly as radical then as it has become at that time. I mean, Betty Ford hailed passage of Roe v. Wade is a great, great decision. Barry Goldwater, that great conservative hero, he supported abortion law liberalization, or at least early in his career. And his wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Can you believe that? That wouldn't happen today. No. And even Billy Graham sort of said at a certain point, I think it was 1968, he said, in general, I would disagree with the Catholic stance. Abortion was seen as a Catholic issue at that time. And he said, I believe in Planned Parenthood. Billy Graham said that. So over time, there was this movement, an intellectual movement called the New Right, led by Paul Weyrich, Howard Phillips, and a number of other folks who were really upset with the sort of Rockefeller Republicans. They saw them as soft on communism. And they also wanted to bring together a movement, including conservative Protestant denominations and conservative Catholics. And as one of the leaders of the movement said, it could also help unite bring in some of our, what he called fringe friends. And they were really looking for an issue that they could use to unite the movement. And the first issue that sort of animated them was what they saw as unfair tax treatment of segregated religious academies. They were very upset that the IRS was starting to look askance at Bob Jones's school and saying, why are we giving you tax exemptions if you're racially segregated? And they saw this as an outrage, but they knew very well that, let's defend the tax treatment of segregated academies. This wasn't an issue that was really going to be able to animate and mobilize their movement. So they kind of went down the list and they looked at the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment for women, but this is already going down in flames. And they got to abortion. It was like number 4 or 5 on the list. And Weyrich said, maybe that could work. So they really united the movement around the issue of abortion. It was really politicized and used for these kind of purposes of building a base, and the pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. They persisted, the sort of pro-choice Republican groups persisted up into the early 2000s, but they were eventually purged. And I think it's easier in a way to unite a smaller group around a more radical core than it is to unite a more disparate group of people that are really only united by their opposition to it. So they've really been very clever that way. And if you can, they know very well that if you can get people to vote on 1 or 2 issues, you can get their vote.
Yeah, well, political scientists know that if I know where you stand on abortion, now I can predict where you stand on guns, immigration, healthcare, climate change, right down the line. It's amazing how predictable we are.
Well, it's interesting. I actually think a lot of people who vote on abortion take nuanced a stance when it comes to issues like climate change or even access to, gun regulation and things like that. But what's happened over time is that leaders of the movement, they know that pastors drive votes. And so they make a huge effort to get sort of conservative-leaning pastors to persuade their congregations the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 issues that they should vote in order to reflect their so-called biblical values. And, when leaders of the movement are talking to the rank and file, or when they're talking to pastors about talking to their congregations, it's all abortion all the time. Abortion is the beginning and the end. But when these leaders are talking to one another in the forums that they share, when they're talking to their political allies, and especially to the sort of segment of plutocratic funders that sort of work in their favor, they're advocating an incredibly wide range of policy positions. They're advocating, a lot of it has to do with economic policy. It's, minimal taxation or no taxation. It's against progressive income taxes. It's arguing against government funding of the social safety net. It's arguing against environmental regulation. I don't think necessarily even sometimes for religious reasons or maybe cast in religious terms, but it's often really because a lot of these industries rely on minimal environmental regulation and minimal business regulation in order to increase and maintain their profits.
Good to remember the EPA was founded under the Nixon administration.
Well, I think the environment really should be a conservative issue. We want to conserve institutions of value that have been served us so well over decades and centuries. I think things like the preservation of a strong public school system and preservation of environmental regulations, and these should be conservative issues. And this hits home the fact that I think this movement is not really remotely conservative. In my view, it's a radical movement.
Yeah, I wonder if more centrist Republicans would agree with your work and say, yeah, we're fighting against that too.
I think many Republicans today feel like they do no longer have a political party.
Yeah, because if you stand up against Trump, you're out. You're done. Your career's over.
I
It's
know.
amazing. It's amazing.
I know. There's so many people around Trump, unfortunately, who are really there not because they're experts in their field, but because,
Obviously, yeah,
you know,
yeah,
but
yeah.
because
Let's go back to abortion for just a minute because you have this chapter which you start off showing how it was invented essentially as their issue. So you just walked us through that a little bit. But Republicans, conservatives always claim to be in favor of freedom, liberty, autonomy, keeping the government out of your lives, except for women in their reproductive choices. Why is that?
I think for many people, there are a number of reasons why this could be. I can't. I don't want to say there's one rule that works for everybody. I think within this movement, for sure, a lot of these issues around sexuality are kind of milked for political gain. Sometimes, if you look at the issues they take up, like transgender bathrooms or things like that, these are not issues that are coming from the rank and file. These aren't issues that are dominating most people's lives, and yet they find this sort of issue that they can use to play to the political anxieties of some of their supporters. And I think the issue of reproductive freedom is also one of those issues.
Yeah, in the moral arc, I speculated on some evolutionary reasons that men have always tried to lord it over women's reproductive choices. Mate guarding, jealousy. Most of the domestic violence happens in one direction, usually around that particular issue. And so I think historically, the Republicans are just tapping kind of a deep-seated issue that most religions try to control women's reproductive choices, and the Christians have just made that a political cause recently. Therefore, another good reason to argue for pro-choice. But of course, they don't think that. I mean, if you ask a conservative, why are you pro-life? They say, well, we believe in the rights of the fetus, and that
Well,
Trump.
yeah, and I think for some of them, they're really genuine about that they really do care, see fetuses having a moral value. Of course, for many other Christians, fetus may have more of that moral value, but it's not the equivalent to the life, or a zygote may have moral value, but it's not equivalent to the moral value of the life of a woman, a person who's already been born, and or a baby, for instance. I mean, as a woman, I think I have children, and I see the value of the children after they're no longer zygotes. But over time, they have been, many of them been persuaded that these are the issue. This is the one issue that they should really care about. And again, we can't lose sight of the importance of the sort of right-wing propaganda sphere in persuading people that this is, the one issue that really should matter when they head to the ballot box. But, interestingly, there was a book that was published when Roe v. Wade was passed. Another data point here, the Southern Baptist Convention published an essay in one of their publications saying this was a sensible middle ground. But then as the sort of political sands were shifting, there's a writer who published a book making that same argument that I just made, which is that the zygote and the fetus have moral value, but it's not equivalent to the life of a baby or a person. And their book was attacked as monstrous. Now, just a decade earlier, it would not have been.
Right.
But it's because it was the issue of abortion has been so valuable for political purposes to that movement. That
it's like, I forget who, maybe it was Bill Maher who said Republicans are pro-life all the way up to the birth of the baby. And then after that, hang them all and let God sort it out, capital punishment and all that, and cutting aid to dependent families and single moms and starving children. That's not very pro-life. Capital punishment is not very pro-life. But see, to the conservative mind, they would say, yeah, those people committed murder, so they should be executed. And killing a fetus is murdering a human life. Therefore, it's the equivalent of that. And the problem is that we have this binary choice. There's no spectrum along there. You're either pro-life or and this divides people so much. Why not say, I'm personally against abortion, I wouldn't do it, but I'm pro-choice because I believe in the rights of everybody. Something like that.
Yes, I think you can be against abortion and not be a Christian nationalist. But if you're allowing that one issue to determine your what you do at the ballot box, if you've allowed sort of yourself to be persuaded that this is the only issue that matters, then you are lending support to a Christian nationalist cause. And here's something else that I think that issue of economic policy that you end up voting for, that sort of abortion and same-sex marriage become the gateways. But when you're voting for those far-right politicians that the movement favors, you're also voting for an economic policy that is stripping the social, hollowing out the social safety net, maligning expertise in government in a way. And that really is inhibiting our ability to care for our most vulnerable citizens, especially in times like now. The consequences of that type of far-right ideology are really only visible typically, a little bit further down the line. In the case of a global pandemic that's actually killing people, the consequences of that type of, hollowing out of government and demonizing government all the time, the consequences are really too stark to ignore.
Helping the poor, you mean like what Jesus said to do?
There's a whole movement of people, probably most American Christians think that religion has something to do with care for the poor and undefended, and identifying people as human beings first and as tribes second.
Yeah, but that's the problem with Christian nationalism that you identified. They don't accept that.
It is a movement that rejects the values of pluralism and diversity and equality.
Yeah. Let's talk about school choice, another one of your chapters. Again, from the conservative, if we could steelman the Republican conservative position, they would say something like, this choosing schools should be a freedom. Yes, we need some public schools, but why not give parents the choice rather than be determined by your zip code where you have to send your kid? And at this point, they usually haul out a single mom, an African-American, say, mother who lives in a poor neighborhood with crappy schools, and she wants to send her child to the nicer school, a public school across the way, can't afford the private schools. What's wrong with that?
Well, we all love the idea of choice. When we go to the grocery store, we want to be able to choose the cereal that we like. And of course, there's no one-size-fits-all education for all families. But I think that when we're talking about choice, and look, there are many people who are involved in charter networks for obviously laudable reasons and want to offer parents various options for their kids. But we can't overlook the fact that there is a certain segment of the school choice world, particularly in the sort of voucher side of it, but also in the a certain segment of the charter side of it that is motivated by hostility toward public education as a whole. And this hostility has really, really deep roots. It goes back all the way, I think, to the era after emancipation. All these sort of pro-slavery theologians, I'm thinking about people like Robert Louis Dabney, objected to public education altogether because he objected to the idea of poor, beleaguered white people, as he saw them, providing, paying money to provide education to Black children. And that hostility to public education sort of was carried through to some of the folks in the mid-century who supported segregation. I'm thinking about Rusas Rushdoony, who wrote a book called The Messianic Character of Public Education. And he railed against government schools, which he saw as basically training women to be men. And, I think for them, anything that sort of fails to affirm their religion, they see as hostile to it. And so they have long had a real hostility to public schools, which teach critical thinking, which are non-sectarian, neither affirming nor denying any particular religious belief, but they also do acclimate children to the idea of diversity. And that hostility has sort of carried through to some of the leaders of the school choice movement today. Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education. Her family she sort of sits at the intersection of two families that helped fund and build some of the core organizations of the religious right. They also spent, I believe it's something like $5.5 million supporting one of these sort of pastors named D. James Kennedy, who had a big TV network, and his he produced a pamphlet called basically anti-public ed pamphlet, casting public education as against atheist and a promoter of unbelief and hostile to Christian families. And so, she comes at this. She's been a voucher advocate for decades, and she has often quietly cast this as an effort to, what she and her husband called advance kingdom gain, meaning direct resources to the kingdom, to their religious schools that they believe in, and to hollow out public education.
Yeah. Yeah, I was amazed reading your book how much money is involved in these nonprofits, billions and millions of dollars, and just maybe a dozen of these 501c3 charitable organizations that give money to move causes in the direction they want, particularly on the school choice. I had no idea there was so much of that. And the Betsy DeVos family, and who's the other family?
Oh, the Prince family. That's her husband. Yeah, her family is the Prince family. She's Betsy Prince and Elizabeth Prince, and married Rich DeVos Jr. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So, but I suppose they might say, yeah, well, again, that's how the game is played. We want to put our money where we can. The problem you have with it is that the 501c3 rules are that you're not supposed to endorse political candidates or, separate or break that wall between church and state. That's where it becomes illegal and therefore immoral in a way, very unchristian-like.
Well, the issue with the vouchers, for instance, also is that a lot of the voucher money goes toward religious schools that are treating contempt for people of other faiths. They are teaching creationism, climate denial, and a lot of them are promoting a kind of Christian nationalist version of American history. So, look, I don't have a problem with religious schools. We actually sent our children to an Episcopalian preschool. We funded it ourselves, weren't in the least interested in getting government to fund it for us. That's a violation of separation of church and state.
Yeah, they seemed, your chapter on pastors and how they train them, it reminded me of one of my best friends, Michael Coles, ran against Newt Gingrich in Georgia in 1996. And so flew back to support him the weekend before Tuesday election. Now, as you know, he lost, and Newt was congressman for quite a while there. But we went to Martin Luther King Jr.'s old church on that Sunday. And, well, I'd never been to a black church before, so this was quite an experience. A couple of us white guys sitting in the middle of this African-American church, and it was really quite a moving experience. The music, the singing, the up and down. This was not at all like a boring Presbyterian Baptist-type church experience. But what was interesting is that the preacher got up at some point. He said, "Hey, by the way, Tuesday's an important day for us. You know what to do on Tuesday. And oh, by the way, look who's here. It's our friend Michael Coles. Michael, stand up and say hi to everybody. Everybody say hi to Michael Coles. Now, you remember Tuesday's an important day." I thought, okay. So this is how they kind of maneuver around the laws that churches can't endorse candidates.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that on the right, it's really sophisticated. It goes beyond saying, "Hey, don't forget Tuesday's an important day." They give these pastors incredibly sophisticated tools, data tools, messaging tools to get out the vote for the supposedly correct candidates. They give them voter guides that leave no doubt whatsoever which way you're supposed to vote in order to reflect your so-called biblical values. They give them videos that they can air at church, and they ask pastors to form what they call culture impact teams within their churches that are designed to get around those IRS rules prohibiting pastors from politicking from the pulpit. So they'll get the pastors to figure out which members of the congregation are connected to other members of the congregation, politically active and engaged, and determined to sort of turn out the vote for those extremely conservative, hyper-partisan right-wing candidates. And one pastor I spoke to about this a couple of years ago, he described this as a God-given loophole. He described this type of initiative, said it's like it threads a separation of church and state loophole, so that it's not the pastors who have to take responsibility for basically turning their church into what is essentially a partisan political cell. If it's the congregants do it, it's a different story.
Yeah, let's talk about my favorite number. My regular listeners will have heard umpteen times. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, the most unchristian person in the history of the presidency, I'm sure. Right on the heels of all the crazy stuff about, the Hollywood Access tape and the payoff of mistresses. And, just how is that even possible?
Well, I think for some people, they see it as transactional. For some people, it was transactional. They think he's going to appoint judges favorable to their positions in the so-called culture wars. He's going to enact economic policies favorable to their pocketbooks. But it goes beyond the transactional. I mean, I think Trump embodies a certain authoritarian style of leadership that the movement wants. Remember, this is a movement that rejects the values of inclusiveness and equality for all, and they really don't have put much faith in the idea of America as a representative democracy. Let's remember that the Republican Party relies on voter suppression and gerrymandering, often race-based, as a strategic imperative. This is how they game elections. So they, if you want an authoritarian leader, you don't want. So if you want to change the political system so that it's no longer a representative democracy, but really is a different kind of order, you don't necessarily want the nice guy. You want the guy who's going to sort of
get in there and kick ass.
Kick ass, as long as the asses he's kicking are belonging to your political enemies.
Yeah,
it's very tribal. It's like you're an insider or you're an outsider. There's sort of pure versus impure kind of thing. There's no longer any of that sort of collaboration and cooperation that we have seen in government in some previous years.
I'm surprised that it wasn't Ted Cruz instead of Trump, because Cruz seems to be a true believer. And he doesn't seem to have any of that baggage. He seems like a moral, upstanding guy, and he's a senatorial fighter. Why Trump instead of him? Or is that just the quirkiness of the system? And Cruz would have been better for Christians, but they ended up with Trump, so they held their nose and pulled the handle for Trump.
I think some absolutely did. I mean, in a lot of the right-wing conferences I attended in advance of the 2016 election, there were obviously some people who were all in for Trump. Some of those leaders were all in for him. And I think he'd been cultivating that cohort for years because he knew that they have the machinery to turn out the vote, to put him in there. But there were certain people, I'm thinking about Penny Nance, who's the head of one of the big anti-abortion organizations, and some others who could barely say his name. And here's the thing. This is why they're winning. They unite when necessary.
Yeah.
Sometimes, Democrats are, well, I'm not sure about, point 7.AB4 on so-and-so's healthcare policy.
Right.
You're rearranging the furniture and the ship is going down.
Right.
So they really do succeed because they are so unified. They do that when needed.
I thought of that the other day when that story came out that, 15% of Bernie supporters are going to vote for Trump rather than Biden. It's like Republicans would never do this.
No, they say, I mean, the messaging was quite clear for people who didn't love Trump. They would say, we're not looking for a Messiah. We already have a Messiah. Well, he's God, guys. You got to line up with what God wants. Or I remember at one event, one of these leaders said, it's judges. This election is about judges. And they basically have, they justify it by comparing Trump to a sort of biblical figure like King Cyrus or King David, sort of imperfect leader who's basically going to restore the nation to its proper purpose.
I guess if you believe you have the final absolute objective truth, then, and you're honest with yourself, you just got to pursue that no matter what. That's the problem with religious truth, is that there's no room for flexibility in there.
Well, I think that the unity of the movement, again, is not in any particular denomination or theological point. It's really united by a common political vision.
Yeah.
And, they want to establish a hierarchy of rights, of course. And saying that our country is founded on the Bible rather than
Yeah,
our
yeah.
constitutional principles is quite a radical thing to say.
Yeah, I had Andrew Seidel on the podcast last year. You referenced his book, and that myth has been thoroughly debunked. But they still buy it, as you have that chapter in there. The other thing I thought of with Trump was, and then to shift to the gay lifestyle, is this: you have that funny story about Falwell saying Jesus was not mild and meek, and he wasn't sort of a hippie looking, Bee Gees looking '70s Messiah. He was an Iron Man. And so they do seem to like now a kind of a authoritarian strongman and Trump is that. He's big, he's loud, he's funny. And mostly my conservative friends, they love that he stands up to the political correct far left, the regressive, so-called regressive left, social justice warriors and all that stuff. And he just sticks it to them and doesn't care. There's a lot of people that like that.
That's true. There's he embodies a certain kind of masculinity and militarism that the movement has long had an affinity for.
It's like Putin, on horseback, shirtless. Some people like that.
That's true, but this is what religious nationalists do all over the world. I mean, if you look at what Putin has done in Russia, or Orban has done in Hungary, or Erdogan has done in Turkey, when they when they bond themselves very tightly with religious conservatives in their countries in order to consolidate an authoritarian form of power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And that's what we're seeing with Trump, with our own hyper-conservative religious people today.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's get into back to controlling women's sexuality, controlling heterosexuality, and preventing the gay lifestyle. That chapter you had on that was just so funny. That guy in San Diego who was gay, and then he had the gay lifestyle. It wasn't really gay. And then to sort of hype up his masculinity, he became a triathlete. It was just so funny.
He calls himself a former. You know what's interesting about him? So he knew I was an opposition journalist. I had written about him before without speaking to him, and then we started a dialogue, and he invited me out to a church event that he did in Chula Vista, California. It was a gathering of dozens of Latino pastors, and movement leaders were sort of explaining to these pastors how to get out the vote for their hyper-conservative candidates. And and most of these Latino pastors are ministering to congregations that aren't particularly wealthy. They might be middle class or working class. But one of the folks who stood up there said, when you're talking to your congregation about these issues, what's more important, talking about the minimum wage or talking? So when you cast it that way, it's like a few extra dollars.
You broke up there. Say that again.
So
the choice between.
So I was at Chula Vista, California.
It gives them the choice between taxes or.
Oh no! What's more important, talking about the minimum wage or talking about life? Okay. So when you put it that way, it's like what's a few extra dollars versus life itself. Right. So this is how they do it. But Doman is a really interesting person, because I think the way that he has kind of turned his own pain into a sort of spectacle and sort of holds himself up as a sort of idea of the good homosexual, the one who can be redeemed, the one who has been redeemed and has redeemed himself. He's sort of signaling that it is that anyone can change, as he asserts that he has changed, and it kind of offers a license to revile those who have not changed. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah. This is the meme of hate the sin, love the sinner, but they don't really love the sinner.
No, unfortunately, there was one speaker at that event who stood up and said, homosexuals, I have nothing against them. And then he sort of went into a diatribe about all the things he does have against people who are in same-sex relationships. And
one of my old cycling buddies was pretty conservative, very Christian, and really worried about the gay lifestyle that was, infiltrating American culture and our children and so on, So I said to him, well, you think your kids are going to become gay? Well, no. And you yourself, do you think you could just switch because of, the influence? Well, no, of course not. I'm not, It's like, yeah. And then when did you choose to become straight? What? I didn't choose. Right. So you try to reason along these lines, but again, religion and, Christopher Hitchens' meme, religion poisons everything. Well, maybe not everything, but it sure does a lot in this department. And also historically, I mean, controlling sexuality is, again, one of the things that most religions have done. And therefore, homosexuality takes people out of the breeding pool two at a time. And so this is something that has to be combated. You take this back thousands of years. And
I don't think it's just the breeding pool. I mean, I think it speaks to, look, sexuality is sort of at the core of who we are. And I think that if you can use these issues in order to tap into people's anxieties, that's more what it's about. I mean, they're not against marriage for people who can't have children, because a lot of people get married who can't have children.
Right.
So I think that it's really about tapping into those anxieties. It actually reminds me of something very interesting, that Phyllis Schlafly said. It was sort of like enforcing this idea of gender roles. She was a really fascinating woman. She gave a quote at one point where she said something to the effect of, women have children and have to take care of them, so men must be compelled to take care of the woman who's having his children and, create a positive way. And I think that in her view, women's rights were going to interfere with men being compelled, not just wanting to, but being compelled to do what must be done to protect women and children.
Yeah.
So I think there is this anxiety. There are all these anxieties about gender roles and things like that. And I think a lot of the opposition to same-sex marriage and to women's rights and stuff is all tied up in those anxieties about gender and gender roles.
I don't know if you know George Lakoff's book, Moral Politics. Do you know George Lakoff? He's a cognitive psychologist at UC Berkeley that studies the psychology of political beliefs. So his analogy, he studies metaphors, cognitive metaphors, like the universe is like a clockwork after Newton, the brain is like a computer, even though it really isn't, and so on. We use these things to just kind of wrap our mind around a complex system that's hard to understand. So to him, the difference between liberals and conservatives is their metaphor of what the nation is. Conservatives think of the nation as a strict father family, and liberals as a nurturant parent family. Much follows from these metaphors, he says. For example, when conservatives say, well, I'm in favor of small government. Yeah, well, what about the military? Oh, no, we need big government. What about the police? We need big government. What about jails? We need big government, big government and courts and so on. So they're not in favor of small government. They're in favor of, a strict disciplinarian family model for government. And that the problem, like of what we're talking about here, is women that have children out of wedlock. No, marriage is the foundation of the strict father family model, and so on and so on. And to me, this was quite enlightening to read this book because, this sort of explains the homosexuality thing. Well, if a straight heterosexual family is the model, then anything that deviates that could corrupt the morals of the society and so on.
It's interesting. They like big government when it does what they want, and they bash government when it does what they don't want.
Right. Yeah, very inconsistent, hypocritical in a way. And then the other funny story you told about how this guy, what's his name again, Dolan in San Diego?
Jim Doman.
Yeah.
Jim Doman.
This I've been a cyclist my whole life, and I've done the Ironman triathlon. I'm a kind of a jock, and I've never once thought when I'm working out I'm really hyping up my masculinity, my gender, my sexuality. It's like, what are these guys thinking that this is going to do? I mean, they have this weird idea that manliness is going out and sweating or something, and this will somehow make them more straight.
There are a lot of women jocks too.
Yeah, of course, right? Yeah. But there seems to be this meme in this Christian nationalism that, again, back to this Falwell's thing where, Jesus was a masculine, muscular, strong, authoritarian, kick-ass military leader. And therefore, that's the way men should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's, I want to be mindful of your time. I know you got a hard out in about 10 minutes. Kind of looking forward to the future. Either Trump loses in 2016 or 2020, it's over. And then maybe what? Pence? I mean, Pence is even more religious than Ted Cruz. So if what you're projecting out, we're going to see this for some time to come, I think.
I think this movement, has long preceded Trump, and it'll long outlast him. and they are really organized, but I'm seeing more activism on the other side than I have in a really long time. I don't think people can really meet the challenges that we face unless they know exactly what it is that we're facing, which is one of the reasons I wrote my book. Look, the right has invested over time in sort of data, media, and messaging, get out the vote efforts. They've really invested in infrastructure, and there's no reason why people who oppose those politics of conquest and division can't do the same and create a kind of positive voting culture. I mean, I continue to believe that these tools of democracy can be used to restore our democracy.
Right. It's like Democratic leaders need to read your book and go, we should be doing more of this big data mining of voters, because that's pretty common now.
Yeah. I mean, I think people on all ends of the political spectrum use data now to get out the vote. But one big difference is that for the religious nationalists, it sort of sits on the top of a long pyramid that operates largely in the religious sphere. So it's exempt from, obviously taxes and also a certain kind of public scrutiny.
Yeah. If we take, say, the 49% figure, say, of number of Republicans or conservatives, whatever the percentage is, what percentage of those would you say are Christian nationalists? The people in your book.
This is a small group in our society. They're really hardcore. Do you know the evangelical pollster George Barna?
Yeah.
He was founder of the Barna Group. He wrote a book, I think it was published in 2016, called The Day Christians Chained America. And he identifies a core group, which he gives them an acronym, SAGE Cons. I can't think of the top of my head what it exactly represents, but it's people who are, spiritually active, governmentally engaged conservatives. He calls them SAGE Cons. And he said there's something like no more than 10% of the population, but they vote at 90%. Right. So they're voting at disproportionate numbers. And that's what you need to turn an election. And let's not forget that this movement is so good at targeting people in very specific slices of different states. They know exactly which district they need to turn, that can turn the state, that can turn an election. So they're really very, very strategic in how they operate.
Yeah, so when I say conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s, socially conservative, I mean, this doesn't include your group, but I think most...
No, sure, I understand what that statement means. You'd have to break it down for me to sort of understand.
Something like openness to interracial marriage is an example. I mean, that was illegal until 1967 in the Loving Supreme Court case. And, polls up until just before that showed most conservatives were against interracial marriage. And now pollsters don't even ask anymore because it's an idiotic question. I mean, who would oppose interracial marriage? That's what I mean by even conservatives today are more liberal than...
Well, I do think that we can't paper over the ways in which hyper-conservative religion and racism tend to reinforce one another. I mean, there is a sort of insider versus outsider, pure and impure, that doesn't always break down to issues of race, but sometimes it really does, and we can't paper that over. We also can't paper over the fact that the Republican strategy now is relying on voter suppression. I think it was Paul Weyrich. He said, I don't want everybody to vote. You can even look it up, you can find it easily on YouTube. He's saying, our influence in election goes down as voting number of people who vote goes up or something like that. And I think Trump recently said something to that effect, and it made the news a few days ago.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is targeting, districts of color and trying to suppress the vote.
How are they doing that? So is that, for example, requiring IDs?
I think there is a number of ways in which it's being done.
Well, because I asked this because PragerU had a new video on, the requirement of ID. You need one for getting a pet license and a driver's license. And, they had a long list, but why not for voting? And
I think there's a lot of purging of voter rolls. Like if you maybe didn't vote in the last, look, I don't think you should have to vote in every election to maintain your right to vote. A right to vote is right to vote. There are elections where I haven't voted because, I'm like, I don't know. some of the smaller local elections. I'm looking at my, who wants to be the bursar of, our local town. I'm like, I have no idea who any of these people are. But you shouldn't be purged, is what I'm saying. Or maybe in previous elections, people have been persuaded often that, there's no one to vote for. They just didn't bother to get to the vote polls that day. Maybe they had to work. But to have voter rolls purged because you have not exercised your right to vote, that's just not acceptable.
So what happens? So the person then goes to vote and then they go, well, you're not on the roll, so you can't vote?
I think it happens in a number of ways. There are a lot of reporters who are covering this issue pretty closely.
Yeah. Well, then I made the mistake of going on Twitter and hammering conservatives for obsessing about ID to do something like voting. But when it comes to the gun show loophole, oh, well, we don't want to go down that road because that's a slippery slope and pretty soon they'll take our guns away. Again, very inconsistent about these so-called conservative principles. They apply them rather inconsistently.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, then one more point before I wrap it up here. That your chapter on Up from Slavery, Ideological Origins of Christian Nationalism. I was amazed that anybody still thinks slavery may be justified even though we don't have it anymore. I just can't believe anybody thinks that now.
I don't think Christian nationalist leaders do either, but they use the issue of slavery sometimes to justify, they almost deracialize slavery and say, well, government funded services is a kind of slavery to the state. And you hear some of the voices, certainly on the more extreme end, saying that type of thing. And it's deeply wrongheaded. First of all, food stamps are not a form of slavery to the state. They're food stamps for people who are hungry. And shouldn't we be feeding our hungry people? And second of all, using like the issue of slavery to compare to that, it's like a way of deracializing, and it's a way of denying the horror of enslaving other people, which is like the worst thing imaginable.
Yeah. When I wrote my chapter, researching my chapter on the abolition of slavery in the moral arc, I was amazed at reading these preachers' sermons around the time of the Civil War, totally justifying it biblically. These are pure Christian values. This is the way God wanted it. The races belong in different continents. That's why they're there. So same thing that the judge in the Loving case that it overturned had argued. Yeah. You quote him. Yeah.
The idea of, these hierarchies rooted in the Bible, the values of biblical literalism have been used to, to justify a lot of horror. I have to, point out that a lot of movement leaders today many of them are involved in racial reconciliation efforts and, want to guard themselves against, accusations of racism. Many of them, resulting from past actions of their denominations. But, in some instances, it's really that they can see the demographic future as clearly as you or I can. Mm-hmm. And they know that the future of their movement can't be all white. So they're really making an effort to sort of capture a certain percentage of voters of color. And they often do that by working with conservative leaning pastors of color. And that's what we saw, at that event with Jim Doman, where it's for Latino pastors, and yet they're trying to get them to turn out their congregations to vote for hyper-conservative candidates.
Well, in California, you definitely got to do that.
Yeah.
That anyway, yeah. So I was going to say something there on that, but I forgot. Anyway, I'm going to read the final paragraph of your beautiful book. In some ways, Christian nationalism is the fruit of a society that has not yet lived up to the promise of the American idea. There is work to be done, but for now we are free to do it. We have met challenges in the past well enough at least to make it to the present moment. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to end democracy. I continue to believe those same resources can be used to restore it. So let's have everybody out there read this book so they can see what's going on and what has to be done in the other direction to keep it safe for democracy, as it were.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. Really a pleasure.